who, I can't speak Scottish, Mike, with an accent. Maybe you could, but this young lad likes nothing but laying on his belly reading books. I don't think anything is going to amount to David Livingstone. And that's what his youth was like, if you can imagine that. From the time he was in his late teens to 20, he also attended college at Anderson College there in Glasgow, which was about an 8-hour walk. In those days, the father took him 3 hours on Sunday. That took the family 3-hour walk on Sunday to church, and it was an 8-hour walk to Glasgow. And that is where he entered his studies and did his studies. And he went to the university there, interspersed with work at the mill. And this was his time and his preparations as he studied in Glasgow. By the time he was 20, he experienced you wouldn't call it a conversion, in the sense that he had never wavered from his father's tutelage, even from infancy, and he had always followed the religious beliefs. But he had a definite conviction that he should be about the Lord's service. And that for him, that meant being a doctor and going as a missionary to China. And so this was a deep conviction of his. One thing you'll learn about studying David Livingstone is once he had a conviction, once he had a belief, he stuck to it with an incredible fervor to stay with his convictions. He never wavered from his convictions. And at that point, he had this conviction. He then went to England at about age 20, just after that, and he went to England, and he enrolled in the London Missionary Society in London. And it was during that time and in his travels around the mighty city of London that he sent letters back. One of them was expressing his awe at the Westminster Abbey. And he said you could go into Westminster Abbey, this he told his family, and see the graves of the heroes of England right there in the floor. Little did he know that 30 years, 40 years later, he himself would have one of those gravestones. I've been there. I've seen the burial site of the body, not the heart, but the body of David Livingstone in Westminster Abbey. But he would write and he would tell his family about all the sites in London. He was excited to meet the people of London, and he listened as often as he could to visiting scholars and missionaries, one of which was Robert Moffat. And it was Robert Moffat that really brought a turning point to the life of David Livingstone. The two of them became friends, and they had oftentimes visited one another and discussed with one another. But this one time, David said to him, might you think that I would be fit for Africa? And Robert Moffat said, well, if you don't just go to a mission station. But he said in the early morning hours, in the midst of the early morning hours, I think he put it, I often see the smoke of 1,000 villages where no man has ever been. No one knows. And the missionaries have never been there. I think you would fit Africa if that would be your dream. And that indeed went deep into the heart of David Livingstone, and at that time said, I will go to Africa. And he set his heart to go to Africa, and that he would see the smoke of 1,000 villages and take and preach the gospel where no missionary had ever been. It's interesting that even today, in Africa, we are going where no man has ever been. And it continues. That burning desire that was in the heart of David Livingstone continues today in the hearts of our circuit riders. So it didn't take him long. In December 8th of 1840, he set out on a ship for Africa. In those days, we complain about a 17-hour trip from here to Africa. Isn't that something? 17 hours, we can hardly stand a 17-hour plane trip. But in those days, it took 5-6 months. And in his case, He set out for Port Elizabeth, South Africa, and along the way encountered a pretty severe Atlantic storm. It ripped the sails of the ship, broke one of the 3 masts, and they were left to the currents, which took him to Brazil. And he landed from England on his way to South Africa in Brazil, and it took months. Of course, while he was in Brazil, he handed out tracts and followed the example of his father, who wouldn't just hand out tracts or evangelize, but would always give goodies with those tracts. And he handed out his tracts with a packet of tea. And this he did as he went along. Later on, he interspersed that with his medical work. But finally, in July, he entered South Africa and was on his way up to the mission station that Robert Moffat had founded in Karuman, which is in now Botswana, and didn't stay long. The mission base there was very, very, very impressive. 500 acres of well-irrigated gardens, flowering trees of Africa were there, the bushes were there, cattle kraals filled with cattle, a carpentry shop well-equipped with lathes and everything that you would need for woodworking, even a blacksmith shop. Everything was there at that mission base, along with several missionaries who seemed to like the mission base and became known to David as veranda missionaries. They loved to sit on the veranda and to view far away maybe the possibility of mission work, but they themselves stayed at the mission station. These were veranda missionaries. David couldn't stay there very long. He was set to go out, and indeed did within a couple of months. He was on his way by ox cart, 16 ox pulling a cart up into the north. And they went to Mombasa, was the first place where they went. And as the pattern was now with David and his travels, he would often go out, come back, go out farther, come back, go out farther. This was his pattern. And he had several travels. And as he would go into these areas, it was about 2 weeks after he left the mission station that he saw his first native Africans, glistening bodies, mostly uncovered, and strange shields covered with rhinoceros hide, and just the attire of the nationals was something that he had never seen. Of course, he couldn't understand their language. And this is one of the things that David did almost right away. He would just completely divorce himself from the English language and sit down and have the people to talk to him. Of course, he would start his medical work right away. And this is the way that he got it and found favor with many of the missionary tribes, was through the medical work. And this he did, established their friendships, got their confidences, engaged in learning the Bantu language at that time where he was, and he did well with it. He made dictionaries, and you saw that. Not without trials. David's life, as you know, was filled with trials. I think his first night in sleeping on the ground in one of the first village that he encountered, he noticed in the morning the ground moving. And he thought, this is strange. What's happening here? And then he looked at his hands, and they were filled with dark spots, especially between his fingers. The African lice at night had just infested his body. And it was with these black spots, and he had to one by one take those lice out. And this was his first encounter. Of course, not all as easy as lice. At that first village, years later, he encountered the lion. And the lion was killing sheep in the village, and the villagers were all excited about the sheep being killed by the lion. They had about 20 warriors that went out with their spears and their clubs to kill the lion. And so David took his gun with his friend Roger Edwards, and they went out to kill the lion. And they surrounded the lion, but the lion charged some of the people, and they just let the lion pass without killing the lion, and they thought the lion was gone, and they were on their way back into the village when David saw some rustling in the bushes and saw the hairy tail of the lion, and was only about 10 yards away from the lion, but saw it well enough to fire. He hit it in the neck. The lion sprang up and took him by the arm and lifted him up like a dog would a rat, and just shook him in the air. And he felt his bones breaking and the flesh tearing. And even today in Ndola, in the main street of our Ndola, there's a statue of David Livingstone being mauled by this lion. Right across the street is a restaurant that I love to go to called The Hungry Lion. It's interesting. And so anyway, he was facing the wilds of Africa and the challenges of Africa. He had so many. Malaria, the tsetse fly. I don't know. I can't go on and tell you all of his encounters. But he would go, come back. And he would go, come back. I think his first trip into the interior was through the Kalahari Desert. They thought in those days the Kalahari joined the Sahara. And that's why the continent was so dark and so empty. But he was to go through the Kalahari Desert. And he came to the marshes on the other side of the desert. He found a great lake there, and eventually a huge river, the Zambezi. And he found that on one of his first travels into the interior. And there in the Zambezi, of course, he found the Victoria Falls. And he just about went over himself in the canoe, but was saved by an island that was in the middle of the river. Some of you have seen that island. It goes right up to the edge, and indeed his canoe had gone to the edge, and he himself was able to get back from the edge. But he saw the smoke that thunders, and he called it Victoria Falls, the first European to see it. But then he went on and up into what is now Luanda. And there he came to the rivers and went through the rivers. That was the common way that they navigated. Went into the rivers and found the outlet of some of those rivers into Angola. Came back, didn't follow the Zambezi, but went inland through what is present-day Zambia, and went over to the Mozambican coast as far as Tet. And it was at Tet that he experienced the Kaborabasa Rapids, which today is a huge reservoir right after the reservoir that we have in Zambia. It's just reservoirs today, but then it was largely rapids. And his hope was that they could navigate the Zambezi from Mozambique back into the interior, but they got no farther than Tet and the Kaborabasa Rapids. He then went up north, followed the Shire River. Some of you know the Shire River, maybe, up into Lake Malawi, then called Lake Nyanza. And it was there that he found that lake. And, of course, all the time sending back journals to England. And he was becoming quite famous, actually, in England for his discoveries and for his finds. And then went into Shire, followed the Shire River up into Lake Malawi. From there over to Lake Tanganyika, and studied that area and followed that area. It was while the time he was in Lake Tanganyika that some of his porters had stolen his bag, his medical bag, and they had taken it back and to collect their wages reported that he was dead, and to prove it, here is his bag. And they collected their wages, and then the rumor went out that David Livingstone was dead. And then, of course, you know the story about how Stanley was sent out to find David Livingstone. Eventually did, and found him up in that area, in what present-day Uganda, Tanzania, in that area. They found one another, and the famous words, Dr. Livingstone, I presume, Stanley uttered, and he said, "I'm Stanley," and he was found there. David's wife, Mary, died while they were on their way up the Shire to Lake Malawi, and was buried there. David Livingstone himself died up around Lake Tanganyika. And in his journal, the last days of his journal, he wrote, I think he died about April 30th in 1873 at age 60. And the last week of his journals he had written, wasn't able to travel today. They had to bring me back. I was too weak. The next day he was able to travel for a half an hour. The next day, a half an hour. I think he had 3 days of half an hour's travel. Is all he could manage. He was so weak. And then he was with two of his friends from his first journeys. Susi and Chuma were his friends, his African friends who were with him. And he had asked Susi for some medications. And then he came back about 2 hours later, Susi did, and found David Livingstone kneeling at his bed dead. Didn't know what to do, but he and his friend took out David's internal organs, buried him under a baobab tree there, and salted and dried the body, and sent the body back to England, where he is buried today in Westminster Abbey. So interesting to study the life of David Livingstone, and even to see how it parallels what is going on even today in Africa amongst our missionaries. He truly explored, opened up the Dark Continent, and it became the way they tried to, I haven't talked about slavery, but they tried to stop the slave trade and to carry the gospel into the interior of the unknown Dark Continent.
Thank you, boy. I learned things about David Livingstone I didn't know. I knew some of them, but what an exciting thing to hear. And thank you, Doug, for presenting that, the life of David Livingstone and all the sacrifices that he went through, you know. And then didn't complete the story, because then the Lord sent another man to follow David Livingstone, and his name was Doug Petersen. And he traveled to all of those places, many of those places as well, and established a work and trained up workers who are now running bases there in that part of the world. People Doug trained and Barb trained are running the work in Zambia, are running the work in Zimbabwe, are running the work in Madagascar, are running the work in Uganda. Doug Petersen probably did as many countries or more than David Livingstone did. And how thankful we are. And we have a base there. You know, they established Livingstonia in honor of David Livingstone, and it's not too far from where our base is at Mangochi. And I went to see that place and visit that, and Doug's been there. And it's not a base now; it's just a sightseeing place. But God did great things and changed a country that was steeped in darkness. You know, we didn't share, you know, some of the heathen practices that were terrible, terrible. The light of the gospel brought them out. And so, well, anyway, thank you, Doug. I really appreciate that. We're going to have somebody do one of these great heroes each Wednesday for the next few weeks, because I want our staff and our students to know about these people and the sacrifice they made to bring the gospel to a world that's lost and undone.